Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to a sort of special topic, I guess. And this is brought to you by the YouTube algorithm because for some reason, I guess because I do philosophy things on YouTube and I like history and I'm a man of a certain age, it thinks I'm interested in getting wisdom from people who were formerly in the special forces of the United States military. And to me, first when I saw this a while ago, this has been going on for a long time, hence why I finally got around to really thinking about it. I thought, what a weird and insignificant notion. But over the time, it's sort of, I've clicked on a couple of them, of course, because I can't control myself, weakness. And I just became fascinated by this. And it turns out that there's this whole genre of former special forces people from I guess SEAL team and Rangers and such like groups who now somehow have built kind of millions of followers and reputations as sort of fonts of wisdom and knowledge. And this is an interesting notion. Now, every culture chooses certain people to perceive as having extra access to special wisdom. And what this tells us about is not so much those people as it tells about the culture itself. So if you look back in history, 50, 60, 70 years ago, scientists and technological specialists were considered. Albert Einstein was asked about all kinds of crazy questions because, of course, he's this brilliant, famous scientist. And so scientists were seen as this sort of special category of people for a while. Before that, religious figures, like often monks, czars and kings and princes would consult monks who had been, out in the wilderness about all kinds of questions that you would think would not nominally be within the specialty of monks. Scholars, of course, in Chinese history, Taoist monks who were almost all ex-Confucius scholars anyway. But these sort of you're a Confucius scholar, therefore we're going to put you in charge of large, engineering tasks. Even though why that would fit you for large engineering tasks is completely unclear. And yet, this is how we're going to do it. Europe, famously, this was what the aristocracy was for. Well, you're going to go to war. Well, you want to get an aristocrat to run the army. Why? Because aristocrats are special. They have an aura of knowledge, special knowledge, because of their backgrounds, their positions, their experience. And so this is a common notion. And for some reason recently, and this wasn't true when I was young, at least as far as I've been able to tell historically, but in the last, say, 20 years or so, maybe a little less, that this notion that people in special forces have access to special knowledge and that they should be consulted and be listened to, I think is an interesting development because it tells us a lot about what is being perceived within part of American culture. This also, by the way, the other one, of course, everyone knows about is now like tech billionaires or tech six, the Bill Gateses and the Jeff Bezos and the Steve Jobs and the Elon Musks are all viewed as having some sort of special status or some sort of special insight. And so you should consult them about all kinds of things that have, of course, nothing to do with technology, about which theoretically they know things. What does this actually tell us and what are they trying to communicate? So first, it suggests that for a group of Americans, it's sufficient for these people to have millions and millions of followers. And I'm assuming most of them are male because I asked my wife and she doesn't seem to get these videos. This desire for and belief in physical capacity, and discipline. A lot of this language is about discipline. One of these gentlemen says that discipline equals freedom. And this is an interesting kind of notion. And so what you gather from this, or what I gather from this, is that people feel that there's a lack of discipline in themselves and in society, and therefore you look at somebody who's theoretically has discipline and you go, right, those people are models because what I really need is discipline. And as I said, one of the slogans that has been bandied about amongst these people is discipline equals freedom. And now, this is not entirely inaccurate. I mean, you can see the point that's being made here is self-control is a type of freedom, because if you see freedom as being the nexus between what you have to do. Okay, so you have no choice but to do something, and what you can't do, right? If you can't do something, well, then you don't have the freedom to do that. And if you have to do something, then you have the freedom, right? It's not a choice. You're just stuck. And so what, in theory, we'll talk about in practice in a second, but in theory, what discipline allows you to do is to train yourself into a position where you can do more things because, you've overcome physical limitations or psychological limitations. And that's, okay, so that pushes the barrier of freedom one way. And then it liberates you from certain things that you have to do. So for instance, if you train yourself to where, and this is classic from history, right? By the way, this is, Buddhism has this tradition, Hinduism has this tradition, nothing to do with military, but they just have this tradition, religious, which is what's kind of deeper going on here a bit, is that, well, if you don't have to eat every day, well, this frees you from having to do that, right? You're no longer impelled to eat. So being able to, go long periods of time without rest, or to go long periods of time without food or shelter, these kinds of things, in theory, expand the range of liberty that you have. But notice that the part of what doesn't seem to be asked, or at least as far as I can tell, is not being communicated clearly, there's certainly an underlying message, is discipline for what? Discipline of itself, of course, does not equal freedom. And so you say, well, what kind of discipline equals what kind of freedom? So, for instance, if you want to train yourself as a sketching artist or as a painter, the kinds of discipline you might pursue are going to be very different than someone who wants to become an investor, say, wants to study investing history and learn about these kinds of things, which would be very different from the kind of discipline to somebody who wants to, I don't know, become a deep sea diver, right? Like what you need to do to discipline yourself and the kinds of discipline you need are highly variable depending on the kind of what you're trying to enable yourself to do. And this is rarely ever suggested, that there are different kinds of discipline that produce different things, because what's the suggestion here is very, very strong suggestion, is that the only discipline that matters and the best discipline is that of rigorous self-training, like physical training, and essentially in violence, right? So maximizing your capacity to enact violence is a great kind of freedom, which, right? Like, I mean, that really is it that great? I mean, is this a useful kind of freedom, right? If you're in the military, it makes a little more sense, but notice there's a big caveat here, several big caveats, I would argue. But one of them is, if you're in the military, the range of what you have to do and what you can do is really tight. Like being in the military is, by definition, having your freedom like greatly, greatly restricted. So one, you have to follow orders all the time, which will come up in a second. You have to dress the way they tell you. You have to live the way they. I don't want to go on about that, but you can see, right? What you're doing is you're volunteering, unless you get drafted or forced to do it, but let's just say you're volunteering. You're volunteering to give away a bunch of your liberty. So on one hand, you've increased your freedom and your capacity in one area, but in another way, and in a lot of ways that a lot of people like to experience freedom, they are in fact not free at all. In fact, you've dramatically and crazily restricted the amount of freedom that you have. And this kind of gives you a tip-off into part of the psychology of what's going on here, although it's not that hard to track out. But it is that the underlying analogy that's being argued here by these gentlemen is that the world is the kind of place where the kind of physical discipline towards performing acts of violence is helpful, is useful, is valuable. Like this is a great thing. This is a great kind of freedom to have, and essentially better than any other kind of freedom. Like there's no other, this is the best kind of freedom that you can pursue, because the world is the kind of place where this is a really, really valuable freedom. And once again, now if you're in the military, so if you've volunteered to be in the military and work in these kinds of places, then this is sort of like a tautology, right? You decided to occupy a space wherein this kind of disciplined physical violence freedom is valuable, ipso facto it's super valuable. But now they're out of that space. And what it tells us, one, is that they kind of miss and long for that, because now they're, if you're in civilian life, this is kind of, generally speaking, not highly useful. One, the states tend to prefer individuals not to do this, and so they like to, police officers, these kinds of people, take care of this kind of thing. And two, it tells us about the fantasies of the people who are admiring them, because they're going, oh, I wish I had this kind of physical capacity. I wish I could exert, dominance and inflict violence on people around me and not suffer any clear consequences. Right? This is the myth, because this would be super valuable. Basically, I think it is the desire. I wish I could intimidate people, right, and feel powerful, feel violence. And it's a great simplifier too, by the way. If I imagine the world is the kind of place that responds to lots and lots of physical violence, which is it's so continuously reinforced by American media in particular. Look at all of the it's, what I'm saying. It's just so omnipresent in American media, this notion that personal vigor and capacity to inflict violence is a solution to just about every problem. Now, that's an interesting fantasy. However, of course, if you look at the world, it has very low utility value, right? This is not, and I think this is part of the frustration. The people, I want to imagine the world is this clear. There's bad people, by the way. Number one, you got to have bad people, because these are the people it's okay to inflict the violence on. And then I'm the kind of person who's trained so I can inflict the violence. Therefore, my world is clear, and the discipline that I've sort of forced on myself has proven that I'm a valuable person, that I'm the strong person who can do this kind of thing, and therefore everything is right with the world. But again, unfortunately, or fortunately, I would say very fortunately, this is not the kind of world we live in, and hopefully not the kind of world we'll ever live in for most people most of the time. And another saying is it's better to be, I love this saying, by the way, it just cracks me up. It's better to be a warrior in a garden than a gardener in a war. Right? Like, this is the idea. And again, the analogy is like, we might at any moment be in an environment where you need a warrior. And at that moment, it's way, 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 way better to be a warrior than to be just a gardener. Now, hilariously, like, this is sort of that these are mutually exclusive, that you can't be a gardener and someone who's been trained in the military is, factually inaccurate, obviously. And that there's a whole history of this, monks and stuff from all over the world who would actually tend gardens and then go off to war and then come back and tend their gardens. A. B, that you're more likely to encounter what? Gardens or wars? Unless you actually go looking for wars, you're more likely to encounter gardens, but by a factor that's, I can't even imagine what that number is. But if you want a war, you can go find them, but generally people go the other direction because people are not entirely stupid, I guess. So, if you look at utility value, much better to discipline yourself to be a gardener and go out there and rake some leaves and, plant some bulbs, because spring will come, than it is to do whatever the hell these people are doing and, saying, discipline yourself. So this whole strange world tells us about the world they want, they think they want, of course, rather than the world as it is. And it also has, in keeping not just with violence and this desire for dominance, is this notion of suffering as being purifying. Hello, Calvin. Again, by the way, I'm sorry, I'll stop saying Calvin one of these days, but not for a while, because as long as I'm talking about the United States, this is what you're going to get. This notion of, again, good versus evil, and suffering is good. And if you suffer, then this purifies you. And when you've been through suffering and you've experienced these moments, then all of a sudden, wow, like now you're someplace new and better. And the suffering itself is part of it, right? So they don't say things like, I get up early because I really enjoy being up, and the morning air is fresh, and I feel so good, and it helps me sleep well. No, it's like I get up and I attack the days. I've never been clear on why days need attacking. Like what have days ever done to us? Also, like your day starts whenever you get up, so it's a bizarre notion that for some reason getting up early is better than getting up late. Again, I've never quite understood this. It's as if it's not as if they're not aware that timekeeping is sort of an arbitrary thing. Like sun comes up when it comes up. So but the notion of I'm getting up before the sun makes me better than the sun. I miss this entirely. I'm never quite sure what people mean, but it's clear what they're trying to communicate, which is like, oh, I'm better, right? This makes me better because I'm suffering and I'm doing this hard thing, rather than saying I like to get up early and have a coffee and watch the sunrise and enjoy myself and pet my cat. That doesn't seem to be the message, because that's not a tough message. That doesn't make us strong and mighty. So this kind of continual invocation of the suffering, and they talk about their suffering and the hardship and all the hard things they've done and how hard it was to do them and how only a few people could, possibly tolerate all this suffering. And you go, okay, in a way that makes me, I think that's good, because it makes me believe in people, right? I think the notion that a lot of people go, hey, this seems like a lot of pointless suffering. I think I won't do this. I'm like, right, good thinking, right? Good for you. Nice choice. But apparently I'm rooting for the wrong team. Obviously, I'm not the right target audience for this algorithmic product. But I'm just amazed that they never seem to say this. They never seem to say, really. Why did I do this? This is sort of silly. Like, what was all this pointless suffering? It's clearly just sort of the hazing. But no, we're gonna be super tough and super well trained, and no one's gonna mess with us. So it creates again this notions of suffering and this false analogy on the world. But it's also weirdly ahistorical, and this is where I think the real, I want to say danger, but the sort of potential evil lurks, if you will. Because of just the timing, the historical timing, most of what they talk about as far as their personal adventures, by the way, of which we have very little reason to, some of this I'm very skeptical. Call me a skeptic, but why would we believe these people? And it turns out that some of them has been proven to be, not real SEALs or whatever, made up some of the things, embellished the history, So often skeptical, but even if I wasn't skeptical and everything they say is true, most of them were involved in the Iraq-Afghanistan campaigns, the overlapping and related American invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq. And what's odd here is these were, I don't know how else to portray them except as, horrible failures, right? Iraq is not a glowing model of a stable society that's pro-West and one of our strong allies in the Middle East and with a great economy. And, the Iraq invasion was a complete catastrophe that cost probably $1 trillion and somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million civilian deaths. Similarly, Afghanistan, similar catastrophe, but on a smaller scale because Afghanistan is smaller and there's less civilians to kill, I guess, and they're less densely populated. And so over the course of more than a decade, what did we accomplish in those two campaigns? Well, not much that's good, and I don't think anybody puts them down as being super successful military operations and super great international achievements of any kind. Like, I don't know, I'm just trying not to be totally negative, but I just, what good? We got rid of Saddam Hussein, that's a plus, I guess, but the aftermath was just generally a complete failure. And there doesn't ever seem to be this articulation of the greater environment in which they're operating. And there's a number of reasons for this. One is because that has nothing to do with them. They are cogs in a machine. Back to the freedom problem. So you freed yourself up to be a cog in a machine. They tell you what to do, where to do, when to do it. And particularly because of the nature of special forces and the operations that they carry out, they tend to be highly, highly restricted. Right? These are high value operations. And so they tend to be, they attempt, at least the government attempts to highly control them and regulate them, right? So it's very bureaucratic, very top down, highly regulated. And so the notion that they did whatever it is that they talk about doing and how amazing they are and what kind of, incredible badasses they are, but also how horrible it was. You always got to put it, because I'll be very horrible and suffering inducing for them and everybody else, and yet still great, and we're super badass. But that notion that this was as part of an, tactically failed, strategically incompetent and geopolitical catastrophe doesn't seem to come up. Right, that they can't meditate on or reflect on the kind of general geopolitical and historical environment in which they were immersed, and in which their theoretically great adventures and exhibition of manly power are given opportunity to range, and they don't recognize, like, wow, I did all this training of this discipline, I actually went over there, probably killed people, and for what? Right? What positive outcome was that? Now, what they are saying tacitly is, well, all that's fine because it allowed me to become this disciplined, sort of amazing person. But you're like, wow, you can see the ethical traps, right? Is it just me, or does there seem to be a few ethical problems with the notion that, well, we threw a war and killed, lots of people, and I did some horrible things, but it's all worthwhile because look, I'm super awesome, and you can be disciplined and great and super awesome like me? Or do we go, there might be a problem here, like there might be something we might want to stop and reflect on and think about before we go that. And then this quickly sort of enters this range of sort of ahistoricity, which is a terrible word. I apologize for that. It's outside of history and outside of any moral or ethical environment, so that this is where they can have, things like, these Nazi guys, they were really great too. And it's as if we're great like the Nazi guys were great. And you're like, wait a second, like we're great like these, Stalinist Spetsnaz special forces guys were great. And you're like, hey, do you see the problem here, right? Like, so they've stripped away all of the, sociopolitical, geopolitical, historical surrounds, and they want to just say, oh, okay, that all doesn't matter. It's like, well, nah, like, hey, I think the people in Iraq think it matters, right? I think a lot of people think this matters. But it's key, at least as far as I've been able to tell, to their narrative to kind of peel that all away, because it's really only about the disciplined individual. And so this creates the final and sort of concluding thought on this. For me, at least, I'm not saying this is the end of what we could talk about, but it is this sort of space that is created, and I think this is the most important message that they are articulating, which is, if you do this, if you're disciplined like us and you become the kind of people we are, like sort of basically highly trained killers, then you will be special. Like all that, so much of their language is us and them, but the us and them is sometimes the enemy, but it actually bleeds over, because again of this lack of geopolitical or historical context, into basically being, there's a few people in the world who are segregated out because they're highly disciplined and highly trained, and they get up at 4:30 in the morning and don't pet their cat, but do something else that's sort of, painful and suffering inducing. Those people are special, literally special forces, right? Like, ooh, and they don't say it like, ooh, we're special forces. They say it like, special forces, spec ops or something like this, right? It's always like, ooh, special, like, so we're going to be special today. That notion of you're going to set yourself apart from those crawly masses. And all those other crawly masses, all those other unspecial people are functionally you can just kill them, right? That it's just fine to kill them because, they're either Iraqi civilians or they're Afghani troops or they're who knows what, but they don't matter because they're not special like us. We're the special people. And so that sort of reimagining of the world where you go, oh, if I were disciplined, if I suffered, and if I drove myself, then I could be this manly, dangerous, imposing person who sets himself apart from and can, if need be, prey on those, I guess, the gardeners who get up late in the afternoon and drink tea and grow flowers, right? That's my natural prey. And then now I'm somebody. Now I have power. And that message is, I think, slightly terrifying. Maybe it's just me. This is why people find this so attractive, right? And you actually see there's this kind of cosplay. They do not refer to it as this, but you can see these kind of some of these exercise bros, like they like to wear the black suits and they like to wear like tactical backpacks and it's sort of like military cosplay, like oh, I'm going to pretend like I'm going to imagine like and dress like I'm sort of one of these special forces guys, and then that'll make me something. But of course, they don't refer to it as cosplay. But it always strikes me as that. But this kind of cultural shift is again slightly terrifying because I go, wow. This is not a value, right? It's easy to make fun of the hippies. Again, this is values a different time, right? If you make fun of the hippies of the 60s and early 70s and like, oh, they're peace, love, drop out, they don't take baths, they grow their hair long. And it's like, yeah, I mean, you can definitely make fun of that. But comparatively speaking, I like it better than the military cosplay, right? That seems less good to me somehow. But it does reflect this deep, I think, confusion and discontent and unhappiness in American society, where people do want this suffering. They do want this. They long for the clarity of violence, of the just us and them. And I started reflecting on this with the reflection on that McCarthy's On the Road, or The Road, not On the Road, a much better book, The Road, where they travel along and it's just suffering and pain and violence the entire way for no reason, with no explication, with no motivation. And I'm like, right, there it is, right? Then if you're a trained warrior, hey, you can, I don't know, win. I don't know if there's no winning there. Like I don't know. It makes no sense to me. So that's what I see. And I don't know if other people have encountered this. Maybe it's just my algorithm. Maybe I've unfortunately been suckered into clicking too many times, and now I continually see this. But I have checked the numbers, and some of these people have millions of followers, probably partly under the umbrella of the greater Joe Rogan universe. So just something to ponder there. Like, what is the underlying message when you see any group, in this case just but any group sort of held up and elevated by your society or a segment of your society at a particular time as unique bearers of special information or special experiences that resonate and should be listened to. And for some reason, which I think we'll articulate a little bit here, but for now, one of those groups is these ex-special forces people, and it's a bit concerning, I would say, but also fascinating. Thank you very much.